Femi, so just assume probably 8-year-old. I have no context to what's happening, but I sit with my parents at home, probably just watching the news. I'm like, what's really happening with these two brothers? Why are they fighting? So just bring it up to speed, because not every one of us took the history class, okay? What exactly is the history to this crisis as we know it? Because we've heard quite a lot of it. So just pull all the puzzle together and summarize and give us a bit of background.
Okay, Fumi, thank you very much. I'm going to try to attempt to explain what's going on in Ukraine and Russia from a historical context and looking at the geopolitics. So basically, we have to go back in time. Ukrainians and Russians are closely related people. There was one time my wife actually asked me what's going on in Ukraine. I gave her a one-liner. I don't think I can do that here. So historically, they share ancestry. That is, Ukrainians and Russians are from the same ethnic origins. That is the Slavic people, or if you like, the Slavonic ethnic group, which is one of the three major ethnic groups in Europe. So somewhere around 800 AD, what is known as Kiev today was founded by Vikings, that's Varangians. And that was the first time the name Rus, from which Russia comes, was mentioned. That is the Kievian Rus. So it's very clear that even Russians trace their ancestry to Ukraine. Okay, and there's a very close relationship between Russians and Ukrainians. In fact, the level of closeness is so high that there's a high degree of intermarriage between them. We have intermarriage occurring at about 17%. So 1 out of every 6 Ukrainians or Russians has in-laws that are across the border. That is for us to just have a context of how close they are. Then the languages, Ukrainian and Russian, are also quite close. They share about 60% of vocabulary. So let me just give you, let me try and bring it into context. Let's say you're a Russian and you've never heard Ukrainian before. When a Ukrainian speaks, you'll be able to pick 5 out of 8 words for a language you haven't heard before. So that is just the level of interrelationship and closeness that the two of them have. Okay, so that's just affinity. So I'm just creating that for you to know that they're really closely related people. Then from there, let's go to geopolitics proper. Ukraine was one of the major countries in the USSR that formed the USSR. So at the breakup of the USSR in 1991, a large number of nations became independent, countries that were before part of the USSR. And I mean, when you're independent, when you leave the house, when you are 18 in this part of the world, or when you are maybe 25 in Nigeria, whatever age it is, you are free to do what you want. You can go and stay outside. So basically, a lot of the former nations of the USSR did not keep ties with Russia. Many of them joined the EU, many of them joined NATO. A case in point are the Baltic states. You might have heard of them: Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. So the Baltic states, they make a good case for former USSR states because they were able to transform their economy, their political system, their educational system in about 20 years, and they have a relatively high living standard. So they are like the star boys, in quotes, of the former USSR nations. So a lot more of the USSR nations look to their example and want to have closer ties with the West because they feel if they are closer to Western Europe and the US, it will do well for their economies and their nations in particular. So I've already mentioned NATO. I'm sure some of us have heard about NATO before. And there's no way we can mention NATO without talking about the Cold War. NATO was founded in 1949 by Western European nations and the US in a bid to protect themselves from Russian aggression. After the Second World War, a lot of the Eastern and Central Europe was taken over by the USSR. So a lot of nations trying to protect themselves went into this military alliance. So we understand that NATO, I don't know if I've mentioned the meaning of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Did I mention that? Just for people that don't know. So NATO is primarily set because of Russia. So you have an organization that is set because of a threat or a supposed threat. So you now have countries that are former USSR states. Or let me put it this way, let me put it in context. Countries that form, like provinces that form part of a former country, joining the enemy in quotes, I mean, from the Russian perspective. So the Russian Federation doesn't take kindly to former states that joined the USSR, that joined NATO, sorry. And let's look at it this way. If you are in Central Europe or you're in Eastern Europe, but you don't share a border with Russia, they don't mind so much if you join NATO. But if you are like Ukraine or Georgia that shares a direct border, it's seen as more of a risk. So let me start off with what happened in 2008, because this Russia-Ukraine crisis actually has a precursor, which is 2008, when Georgia tried to move close to the West, tried to join NATO. Georgia shares a southern border with Russia. And what happened then to Georgia was that something similar. There was a military intervention. Putin calls this one special military, what's it called, operation. So Georgia was invaded just to make sure that it didn't join NATO. That was back in 2008. And the response from the West was to throw Russia out of the G8 then. So they renamed it the G7. So we know that this kind of thing has happened before. But if we want to look closer to Ukraine, we'll have to go back to 2014. That's about 8 years ago. Go back to the Euro Maidan. That was a revolution that happened in 2014, where the then president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, was ousted in a popular uprising. So the background for that was that Yanukovych was a Russian-backed president of Ukraine. And there was a lot of agitation in Ukraine, like I've mentioned before, to join Europe, to be closer to Europe. There was a treaty that was even signed. It was like a preliminary agreement to join the EU. So Yanukovych led the people on, and last minute to sign the treaty, he did a 180 and then chose to take a loan from Russia. And Ukrainians didn't take that lightly. I'm sure quite a few of us remember that in 2014, there was a lot of rioting, there was a lot of anger, there was a revolution and the center of the revolution was the Maidan Square. For those of us that live in Lagos, I'm sure we know Freedom Square in Ojota. So it's something like that. And to be honest, people in the West actually supported this revolution. We had American senators fly into Ukraine and join them in the revolution. Senator John McCain was there and saying, "We're with you, we support you, you can do whatever you want." So Yanukovych was removed and replaced in a subsequent election by a more Western or US-leaning president, which is Viktor Poroshenko. So Russia did not just, sit back and fold their arms. Immediately, they lost their man in Ukraine. They did two things. First thing was to grab Crimea, which was formerly a Russian. There's a history behind Crimea. It was formerly Russian. It was ceded to Ukraine, but they had to grab Crimea for strategic reasons. Crimea is the only, it gives access to the only warm waters, the seaport, where Russia has their Black Sea fleet, which supports military and commercial purposes in the Black Sea. So they grabbed that through a kangaroo referendum in 2014. and also started inciting separatist movements in the eastern part of Ukraine. Now, for those that are familiar with Ukraine, the Donbass region, which is a composition of Luhansk and Donetsk. For the football fans here, I'm sure you heard Shakhtar Donetsk before. That's where Shakhtar is from. It's a very rich area of the country, highly industrialized. So Russia started supporting separatist movements there. And it led to something of a civil war, something like that, something of a civil war. And then there was a popular plane crash in 2014, 2015, where a commercial jetliner was brought down by separatists. So this was the beginning of the issues Russia had with the West. Russia was sanctions were placed on Russia for supporting separatists in that part, and basically that is where the trouble with Ukraine started. So it's been going on for a while. It's not just a war that started overnight. It's been going on since about 8 years now, but just in the separatist areas. So what happened with the election of Zelensky about, I think, in 2019, the relations between the West and Ukraine was ramped up another level. So we have Ukraine that is basically not a member of the EU, having very high cooperation with the West. And this is not just economic cooperation. If it were just economic cooperation, it wouldn't be a problem. We have cooperation that is military in nature. If some of us remember, Donald Trump was under a lot of pressure during his administration to support the Ukrainians with lethal arms, which he eventually did under pressure. So we have the US funneling in a lot of lethal arms to Ukraine, which you would consider to be wrong. I mean, having no military cooperation with the country. So that's what happened in Ukraine. And then from Russia's point of view, I have my next door neighbor, which is my brother, or who I consider king, cooperating very closely with the US. And Russia began to see this as a form of existential threat. An existential threat is a threat that a nation sees as likely to affect their existence. Let me just explain this. Once a country is a NATO member, it has very close military cooperation with the US and Western Europe. And what this means is that the US can install missile systems in this country. So, I mean, the fear for Russia is that missile systems can land on their doorstep through Ukraine, and that will not be good for their existence. A case in point is the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, where Soviet missiles were placed in Cuba. And then the reaction of the US is much like what Russia is doing today. Although the US did not invade, there was a last-minute agreement and missiles were removed. So that is for the background.